Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. As my Australian viewers would know, I am frequently rung by the media and asked to explain or comment on constitutional and legal matters and to write opinion pieces. Like this channel, I treat this as public education, and so I do it. Occasionally, I get tipped off in advance that something is likely to occur and asked to be on standby in order to comment on it. Now, that happened to me yesterday when 3 different media organisations contacted me. The gist of the story that they told me was that they thought that King Charles was very seriously ill and that he was planning to announce that he would abdicate. Now, this struck me as most unlikely, as for the British royal family, unlike other European royal families, abdication is a great taboo. Indeed, authorised sources close to the royal family tend to quote the line that says, "What suicide is to a man, abdication is to a king." They see the implication of choice as undermining the whole point of hereditary monarchy. Now, when I queried the source of this tale, the only concrete element was that the palace was going to make some kind of media announcement at 6 p.m. on Friday, UK time, which was 3 a.m. On Saturday here in Sydney, Australia. Hence, the media organisations were trying to corral commentators in advance so that they weren't scrabbling to find people who could explain the process of abdication and its impact extremely early on a Saturday morning. Fair enough. So I did spend a couple of hours on Friday afternoon going through all my primary material on abdication, which I'd drawn from various archives just to get up to speed in case it was needed. The question I was asking myself was whether legislation would be necessary to give effect to an abdication, as this would prove quite problematic in relation to abdicating for each of the king's different realms, including Australia. Now, as it turned out, the announcement that the palace made was simply about the king's improved health and that he was returning to some public duties. So the great kerfuffle over abdication was actually pointless and probably has never even been revealed by the media. However, seeing that I did a bit of work on this, and I thought it was quite interesting as I was looking at it, I thought, well, I'll at least preserve it and do a Clarion video on it, because the next time the media gets spooked, like those poor horses in Whitehall last week, and the abdication rumours start flying again, I can just point them to this video. From a legal point of view, there are 2 problems in relation to the abdication of a British monarch. First, there is no law that stipulates how abdication is to be done. It's considered to be so far out of the bounds of acceptability that it's just simply unaddressed, unlike regency, for which there are laws. Second, we are almost completely lacking in appropriate precedents to give any guidance as to how this should be done. On the precedent side, abdication is extremely rare for British and, prior to that, English monarchs. The earliest case is that of King Edward II. Now, he was pressured by his wife and indeed many others into abdicating in favour of his son in January in 1327. A proclamation declared that Edward, lately King of England, of his free will and by the common council and assent of the prelates, earls, barons and other nobles and the whole commonalty of the realm, has abdicated the government of the realm. The Speaker of the House of Commons then gave effect to that abdication by formally renouncing allegiance to Edward II on behalf of the nation. Just an aside here, I cannot see today the role of the Speaker here in fulfilling such a function, especially in relation to the realms, who the Speaker, of course, could not represent. Anyway, Edward II's son, Edward III, was a minor at the time, so there was a regency. Post-abdication, the former king was held under house arrest, where he soon, quote, died in his sleep, unquote, under suspicious circumstances. Almost 300 years later, Sir Edward Coke had this to say about Edward II's abdication. He said, "The king cannot resign his crown to anyone inasmuch as he holds it immediately from God, and there is no power superior to him under God. Therefore, where the chronicles speak of a resignation of the crown by Edward II, that could not be." Now, moving on from Edward II, some argue that Richard II abdicated rather than being deposed, but again, because he was being held in prison at the time and then died, it is unclear if he really did abdicate, and if he did, how it was done. Another claim is that James II abdicated, but it's probably more accurate to say that he was deposed and fled England, tossing the Great Seal into the River Thames as he went. Now, this might be regarded as a constructive abdication of the throne, which takes effect by way of common law, but again, there's no formal documentation to use as a precedent. Instead, the Westminster Parliament declared that James had, quote, vacated, unquote, the English throne. One more interesting and largely unrecognised event was the termination by Queen Elizabeth II of her role as Queen of Fiji in 1987. Now, you may remember there had been 2 coups, but the Queen herself had continued to assert her role as monarch and the illegality of those coups. However, after the Governor-General of Fiji asked the Queen to change the constitution of Fiji in a manner that would have discriminated against Indo-Fijians while preserving positions of power for Indigenous Fijians, the Queen decided herself to terminate her role and accept that Fiji was a republic. In doing so, she acted of her own volition and not on the advice of her Fijian ministers or indeed her British ministers. Moreover, it was effectively done by press release rather than any formal instrument. According to her private secretary at the time, Sir William Heseltine, quote, Mrs. Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister then, Mrs. Thatcher was quite opposed to the idea of the Queen, as it were, abdicating. But it wasn't up to her, that is Mrs. Thatcher, because it was as Queen of Fiji that Her Majesty had come to this conclusion. This, of course, was not the usual form of abdication, which operates as a demise of the crown, as if the monarch has died, and causes the next in line to the throne to inherit it. Instead, it was a voluntary termination of the crown of Fiji. What's most interesting about it was that it was a significant constitutional act that was performed by Her Majesty the Queen without any ministerial advice. This brings us to the only relevant, or at least I would argue only partially relevant, abdication, which is that of King Edward VIII. As is well known, he abdicated so that he could marry Wallis Simpson, as neither the British government nor the governments of the Dominions were prepared to accept Wallis Simpson as Queen or to accept a morganatic marriage in which she would be his wife without becoming Queen. On the 23rd of November 1936, the first legal advice was given to the UK government about the procedure for an abdication. One of the biggest problems was how an abdication was to be given effect in each of the then dominions so that it would occur simultaneously and legally. Sir Maurice Gwyer, who was the British Parliamentary Counsel, took the view that the instrument of abdication should be executed voluntarily by the king without any ministerial advice. This was because the advice of British ministers could not support the king's abdication in relation to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and the Irish Free State. To avoid any political problems, it was therefore preferable for the king to abdicate in relation to all the dominions and to do so of his own motion without ministerial advice. However, Sir Maurice also advised that legislation was necessary, and this was because it would be necessary to amend the Act of Settlement to bar any of Edward VIII's descendants from the line of succession to the throne, and also it would be helpful to amend the Royal Marriages Act so that the new king would not have to face the dilemma of whether to give consent to his brother's marriage to Mrs. Simpson. There was also an issue about the relationship between the instrument of abdication and the British legislation, which would give it effect. The legislation needed royal assent, so it was considered safer for the abdication in the instrument only to come into effect once Edward VIII himself had given assent to the legislation. The use of British legislation to give effect to the abdication, however, raised problems about whether this law would apply to alter the law of succession to the throne in each of the dominions due to the application of the Statute of Westminster, 1931, and the conventions that were set down in its preamble. There were intense negotiations about this with the dominions between about the 4th and the 10th of December. Now, I won't go into the details here. I have written about it elsewhere and it is quite interesting. But the upshot was that the abdication ended up taking effect in different dominions on different dates. There was even a risk that the Irish Free State would not legislate to give effect to the abdication, leaving Edward VIII as King of the Irish Free State and George VI as King of the United Kingdom and the other dominions. British legal officers even debated amongst themselves whether they could then claim that there had been some kind of a de facto abdication in those circumstances. But in the end, the prospect of having the twice divorced American Wallis Simpson as Queen of a Catholic Ireland was just too much to bear. So the legislation was passed by the Irish Free State to give effect to the change of succession, although it was also deliberately done to come into effect on a separate date as an assertion of the Irish Free State's independence. So, if King Charles decided to abdicate, which again I think is most unlikely, but nonetheless, could it be done by a mere instrument of abdication at his own motion and without ministerial advice, or would legislation be required, including possibly separate legislation in some or all of the realms? Now, some people claim that legislation would be required in relation to any abdication. In part, this is simply because they hark back to the one recent precedent, that is of Edward VIII, where legislation was used. But there is also a bit more to it than that. Back in 1936, one of the advisors on the UK government's files stated that the abdication of a sovereign and the accession to the throne of the person next in line of succession under the Act of Settlement necessarily involves an amendment to the Act of Settlement, not only for the purpose of confirming the title of the successor, but also for the purpose of barring the descendants of the sovereign who has abdicated. Some academics have also taken that view. John Alder, for example, in a constitutional law book in the United Kingdom, suggested that since the status of the monarch is conferred by law without a voluntary act, it cannot be terminated by a voluntary act, only by way of law. But I have my doubts about this. The death of the monarch causes changes in the line of succession and causes the accession of a new monarch to the throne without any amendment to legislation. If abdication is treated as a demise of the crown in the same way as the death of a monarch, then it does not require any amendment to legislation. Legislative amendment would be needed to address any other changes, such as to exclude future children of the former monarch from the line of succession. For Edward VIII, this was relevant because he could still have had children, and without a change in legislation, they would have overtaken the children of King George VI in the line of succession to the throne. But King Charles already has two sons who also have their own children. Hence, any further legitimate children of King Charles, as unlikely as that might be at this stage, would be so far down the list of succession that this remote prospect would not create a need for legislation to rule it out. Accordingly, I think an abdication in such a case could occur by way of a simple instrument executed upon the motion of the king without any ministerial advice and without legislation. But it would need to make clear that he was abdicating in relation to each separate crown in his different realms. And unlike at the coronation, each of those countries should be separately named. Now, while I doubt that this advice will be needed, it is nonetheless an interesting topic. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you on the Constitutional Clarion next time. Goodbye.